Let's talk about scales of measurement. Okay, we've got four different scales of measurement we're going to go over. The first is going to be nominal data. And nominal data, or categorical data, as it's sometimes called, is about data that fits into categories. It can't be easily summarized by numbers. Instead, you can basically do frequency counts, right? So if I wanted to summarize the average college student in terms of their political preference, we could take the number of Democrats, we could take the number of Republicans in a sample of college students, and maybe we have an other category. You can't take Republican, Democrat, average them together. What would you even call that? Well, instead, we basically have to say, okay, there were this many Republicans, this many Democrats, this many others, and we could, if we wanted to standardize, we could represent those, I guess, in percentages or something. That's how you handle nominal data. That's an example. And there are all kinds of different things that you might measure using nominal data. So you could look at whether people like, what kind of pets people like, right? You could look at what their religious preference is, right? Anytime you're sort of getting a descriptive information about an individual that's not a number, right? You're sort of assigning them to categories, right? That would be where you're using nominal data. Ordinal data. Ordinal data is data that has an order to it. So, for example, in the Olympics, we rank people first, second, and third. So, if you look at the bobsledding, I like to watch bobsledding and luge and those kinds of events where people are going way too fast down really slippery slope with very little protection. I don't know why that appeals to me, but it does. So in that case, the fractions of a second, it's like down to thousandths of a second, that might determine the difference between the top scoring teams. So if you've got one team that has this time, and then the second team might be just a couple of milliseconds behind them, but then the third team might be, a half second later, right? So in other words, in terms of the actual time, by knowing that they're first, second, and third, it doesn't tell you anything about the exact distance between their times. It just tells you the order. So therefore, it's ordinal data. Now, in terms of what you can do statistically with ordinal data, you have a few more options than you do with the nominal data, but it's still not ideal for many of the standard statistical tests that we use, like a t-test. The next two types of measurement are interval and ratio scales. And these two are very similar to each other in practice, but they have an important difference between them. Interval scales are any kind of scale that has the same distance between each of the units. A good example of an interval scale, it would be something like year. So we are in the year 2020, let's say, and the difference in time between the year 2020 and the year 2021 is the same as the difference in time between the year 1920 and 1921. But the starting point is where we have a problem, right? Because year zero is not the dawn of time ever. It's sort of a point that we said this is going to have to be the starting point for how we measure history from here on. And we sort of all had to just sort of agree on it. So that's an interval scale because the interval doesn't change from each of those units from one to the next, but the 0 point is arbitrary. A ratio scale is a scale in which the interval is the same between each of the units as you move along the scale, but it has a true 0 point. So, for example, in terms of behavior, let's say, number of cigarettes smoked, right? If you're counting the number of cigarettes smoked, you can't unsmoke a cigarette. You can't smoke less than 0 cigarettes. So therefore, the number of cigarettes smoked would be an example of ratio scales because there's a true 0 point. Now, in practice, we typically treat, for most common statistical tests, we treat interval and ratio scales the same, but there is that subtle difference where the true 0 point is characteristic of ratio scales. My advice as a psychologist is whenever possible, try to use interval or ratio scales because that opens up the type of statistical tests that you have available to you. There are statistical procedures that allow you to analyze differences between groups with nominal data and groups with ordinal data, but it can be a little trickier. There is some argument about whether or not Likert type scales that you often see in psychology, where they rate things like attitudes or self-report measures and things like that. So they want to measure your level of narcissism, and so you go and you answer a bunch of questions like, I think I'm really great on a scale of 1 to 5, right? And you have to rate strongly disagree to strongly agree. There's some debate on whether those would be an interval scale or whether they're really ordinal scales. Because think about it, the difference between neutral to slightly agree might not be the same distance as from slightly agree to strongly agree. Right? So it really depends on the interpretation of the individual, whether they sort of can accurately parse the numbers on the scale into exactly the same intervals between them. And so a lot of people argue that they are actually, or they generate ordinal data. For my purposes, I'm relatively comfortable saying, let's treat them like they are interval data, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so that's a quick overview of different scales of measurement. I hope this has been helpful. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And we've got a lot more videos coming, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.